You're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
I'm always excited to sit here at the desk behind the golden Dixie Heritage microphone to record another episode of TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. This week's show is going to feature an interview that I actually recorded a few weeks ago with historian William Connery. William Connery is a historian who has appeared several times on the History Channel, on PBS, and on a number of other television and radio venues. He's also the author of 4 books, and he's a regular writer for several Civil War and War Between the States publications. The audio is a little off in this recording, mainly because Dr. Connery is soft-spoken at times, and so we had to boost the audio. When we boosted his audio, we also boosted my audio, so sometimes I seem a little too loud, sometimes he seems a little quiet. What you might find yourself doing as you listen to this interview is you might be taking your volume and turning it up and down at different times. We apologize for that. The interview was recorded over a cell phone, and again, sometimes the audio is not good there. But Dr. Connery had some great information that he shared with us, things that I did not realize. For example, there were War Between the States battles being fought as far away as places like Russia and Australia, that the Navy continued to fight years after the war. In fact, there was even an attempt to invade and conquer San Francisco long after the war had officially ended, because there were ships out in the Pacific, Confederate ships out in the Pacific, that simply did not know that the war had ended. And so some really interesting stuff, and you're going to thoroughly enjoy the interview, and you're going to learn a lot. So let's go right into it. Hello, Dr. Connery.
Yes.
Doctor, why don't you tell us just a little bit about yourself? Tell us, who you are, maybe some of the books that you've written and the work that you've done for the History Channel and so forth, so that we'll know who you are and what it is that...
It's William S. Connery. I was born in Baltimore. Sometimes people ask me, Mr. Connery, you seem to know so much about the Civil War. Why you must have either a Confederate or maybe even a Yankee ancestor. I've done some research. As far as I know, I have no Civil War ancestor, but my birthday is coming up in 2 days, January 19th. And if you were a son of the South, I think you know whose birthday that is.
Yes, sir.
Robert E. Lee. It also happens to be Edgar Allan Poe's birthday, who is buried in Baltimore. So I feel like I have some connection to General Lee and to the master of the macabre, as some people call him, Edgar Allan Poe. And there's a bunch of modern people too. So I grew up in Baltimore. I attended, eventually I graduated from University of Maryland with a bachelor's in history. I have a master's in religious education. Don't have a doctorate yet. Actually, my eldest son is the first one in the family. He is a MD, PhD. And he is doing his residency up in Greenwich, Connecticut. His wife is from Bridgeport, Connecticut. I have one grandchild, a grandson, Matthew, so far. And I have 2 books from the History Press, part of their sesquicentennial series. Titles are Civil War, Northern Virginia, 1861, and Mosby's Raids in Civil War, Northern Virginia. And I also write articles for the monthly paper, the Civil War Courier. Actually, in the present issue, January 2018, I have an article on the Battle of Drainesville, which was pretty much a skirmish at the end of 1861 up near Leesburg, Virginia. But this church, which is a pacifist church, the Church of the Brethren. Every year they have a service to commemorate the battle, and it's quite striking because at the end of the service they have like 50 candles set up on the altar, and they read. There were about 50 men, Confederate and Union, who were killed in this battle, and as they read each name, John Smith, the person on the altar, snuffs the candle out. So, it's like the person's life is snuffed out, and then they read each name and they snuff out the candles until the church is dark, and then someone comes up the aisle with a single lit candle, representing Jesus as the light of the world that cannot be put out. The latest issue, I had an article on that and about the Battle of Drainesville. I speak to various groups from Gettysburg down past Richmond. As a matter of fact, tonight I am speaking in Salisbury, Maryland, to the General Elzey camp of Sons of Confederate Veterans there. I mainly speak to Sons of Confederate Veterans, to the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and my first book, Civil War in Northern Virginia, 1861, I was awarded the Jefferson Davis Historical Gold Medal for my research for that book, and I did not set out to give a Confederate or Union viewpoint. I like to call my research the Joe Friday, if you remember the old Dragnet program.
Yes,
just
sir.
The facts. Just the facts, ma'am. Just the facts. Don't put any flowery stuff on it. Just give me the facts. So that's what I try to do in my books, in my talks, and the articles.
Well, one of the facts that I had read in one of your articles was that the war between the states did not end when most people think that it ended.
Yeah, actually, it's kind of a misnomer that people, when you ask, you've heard about the Civil War. Oh, yeah, that happened when Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. And the fighting pretty much ended then, but that was not the end of the war. Actually, General Joe Johnston was still fighting Sherman in the Carolinas, and he did not surrender until April 26, 1865, about 2 or 3 weeks after Lee surrendered. That was not the end. President Davis was still trying to get out west to set up the Confederate government again, and he was captured in Georgia in May 10th, 1865. That was not the end. June 2nd, 1865, General Edmund Kirby Smith surrendered a Confederate army to Union forces, and most people agree that the final surrender was when General Stan Watty, who happened to be the first Native American general in an American government. People forget. I like to remind people that a lot of people, those Confederates, they were all white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. No. First Native American general was Cherokee Stan Watty. The first Jewish Secretary of State in an American government was Judah Benjamin in the Confederate States government. Now, there were some people like Edmund Ruffin. He refused to accept anything. Actually, Edmund Ruffin, who is according to tradition or folklore, fired the first gun towards Fort Sumter in April 1865. June 19th, 1865, he was staying with his son and his daughter-in-law. He went up to his room, his office, with a rifle and a forked stick. And he wrote, "And now with my latest writing and utterance, and with what will be nearer to my latest breath, I here repeat and would willingly proclaim my unmitigated hatred to Yankee rule, to all political, social, and business connections with Yankees, and to the perfidious, malignant, and vile Yankee race." And some of us would say, "Oh, Mr. Ruffin, tell us what you really think about the Yankees." Upon which he stuck the rifle in his mouth, had the trigger cocked, took the fork, because it was one of these musket rifles, and blew his brains out because he did not want to live under the Yankees. And of course, some people say the war has never ended, and in various parts of the world, people actually celebrate the Confederacy. In Eastern Europe, when they broke away from the Soviet Union, there were Confederate flags displayed as a sense of rebellion against the evil empire, as President Reagan called the Soviet Union. And even today, there's a small part of Brazil where they have what they call the Festa Confederada, which is their celebration of their Confederate ancestors who refused to stay in the United States, and they went south as part of migration from the Confederacy because they did not want to live under the United States. Now, while General Watty was surrendering in June 1865, the Confederate raider, the CSS Shenandoah, was beginning its depredation of the New Bedford whaling fleet up in the Bering Sea. I will go into detail later as we get more into this.
So where is that at? You said the Bering Sea. Would that be around like the Bering Strait area by Russia, or would that be?
Yeah, by Russia, up there.
Okay.
The New Bedford whaling fleet had pretty much exhausted the whales, and the whales they're very smart animals. They had migrated up to the Bering Sea and actually into the Arctic Ocean. Also, they were aware that there were still Confederate raiders out there, and they thought it was impossible for a Confederate ship to make it up to the Bering Sea.
So now, where was the New Bedford Navy from? What country was it from?
Well, they were privately owned ships, but they were hunting whales and getting whale oil to be sold in the United States. So they weren't under the United States government, but they were selling their whale oil into the United States.
Okay, so what country were they from then?
From the United States. New Bedford and New England.
Oh, okay. Okay. Wow.
Now, at the beginning of the war, the Secretary of the Navy for the Confederacy was a gentleman by the name of Stephen Mallory, who had been a U.S. Senator from Florida. And he'd been in the Senate from 1850 until Florida seceded from the Union. He had been chairman of the Committee on Naval Affairs. He was named Secretary of the Confederate Navy by President Jefferson Davis in March 1861, and he remained as Secretary until the very end, May 1865. Now, he knew what the United States Navy and the U.S. government was capable of. So he knew there was a disparity between the shipbuilding and other merchant and manufacturing facilities of the Confederacy and those of the Union. And so he had a fourfold plan for the Confederate Navy. First, send out commerce raiders to destroy the enemy's mercantile marine. Second, to build ironclad vessels in southern shipyards for defensive purposes. Third, to obtain by purchase or construction abroad armored ships capable of fighting on the high seas. And fourth, employ new weapons and techniques of warfare. And if you look at each of these, he was pretty successful. Commerce raiders, of course, the Alabama was the most famous, and then the Shenandoah did its share of damage. Ironclad vessels, like the CSS Virginia, obtained by purchase armored ships. I'll go into detail later. And fourth, employ new weapons. The Hunley, the first successful submarine, was built in the Confederacy. Water mines, which they called torpedoes. The famous quote from Union Admiral Farragut, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." They were not the torpedoes we think of that, swoosh through the water, but these were the mines that the Union ships would bump up against, and then they would explode. These and other inventions were made by various departments of the Confederate Navy.
And so the ships that you were talking about, I'm assuming that they were made in foreign countries, that they had to be obtained from foreign shipyards?
Yeah. Actually, the main agent who was sent out by Mallory was a gentleman by the name of James Bullock. James Bullock had been in the U.S. Navy. He was in the U.S. Merchant Marine when the war started, and actually he had a ship from New York in New Orleans when his native state of Virginia left the Union, and people came to him, "Captain Bullock, sir, your state has left the Union. You should confiscate that ship and turn it over to the Confederacy." And he said, "No, this ship belongs to owners who are in New York. I will bring it back to them." So he boarded the ship, went around Florida, wound up in New York, and while he was there, heading back to the Confederacy, he met with his sister, who had married a Yankee, and her 3-year-old son later on said, I remember Uncle Jimmy coming to visit us on his way south. And that little boy, his name was Teddy. Later on, his nickname was changed to Teddy. We all know him as the founder of the teddy bear, Teddy Roosevelt. And for example, in 1905, Teddy Roosevelt made a trip to the South, and he visited his mother's ancestral home in Georgia, and he declared, "I am as much a son of the South as I am a son of the North." I believe he was the first president who had a trip into the South, and that was 40 years after the conclusion of the war.
Wow, that's interesting. I never realized that.
So James Bullock was over in Liverpool. It gets, I don't want to go too much into the weeds, as some people say, but England, United Kingdom, Great Britain, whatever you want to call it, had a Neutrality Act which said if we are not at war with nation A, and that nation A is at war with nation B, we cannot support nation B because we're not at war with nation A. So the Union used to say, see, England is neutral. They can't support the Confederacy because they're not at war with the United States. So Bullock For example, he made the plans and had a ship built in Liverpool that was originally called the 290, and it was built under his specifications, and it renamed the Alabama. And for 2 years, the Alabama sailed the seas, destroyed about $20 million in their money, which is about $200 million in our money of Union shipping, until it was finally stopped by the Kearsarge off of the coast of France in June of 1864. Also during this time, Bullock and also Slidell in France were trying to build these iron brands, as they called them. None of the ships that were constructed as iron, there were a couple of them in England, and they were confiscated by the British government. There was at least one. Actually, the one in France had a very interesting history. It was built as the CSS Stonewall, of course named after General Stonewall Jackson, and it was actually the only Confederate ironclad that sailed for the Confederacy, but it sailed from France to Havana, got stuck in Havana. The war ended. It was confiscated by the United States, and it was eventually sold to Japan. And so the first Japanese ironclad ship, which they called the Kotetsu, was a ship that was originally built for the Confederate States Navy.
I never realized that. Were these ironclads, were they, and I should know the answer to this question, but I don't, because I've studied more of the land battles than the naval battles. Were these ironclads actually steel ships, or were they wooden ships with a metal shell laid over the top of them?
Yeah, they were wooden ships with the ship. The Stonewall was completely encased in iron, so it was, and it probably had an iron frame too. So for all intents and purposes, it was a not just a steel-clad ship. It was a pretty modern ship. But
so then, technologically, it was far ahead of its time.
Oh yeah. It's believed that if it had been built earlier and had been able to take to the seas, there was no Union ship that could have taken it on.
So was the Union Army and the United States government so desperate for money at that point that they would sell the probably greatest fighting vessel in the world to the Japanese?
Oh yeah, because it was built by the Confederates. We can't have that.
Okay.
You know, if people find out our greatest naval ship was built by the Confederacy, oh my God, that means they were better than us. We can't have that.
Right.
We gotta build our own ships. We don't need those GD Confederate ships. Which when I later on I'll talk when I get into about the Shenandoah, the same thing happened to the Shenandoah too.
Can you pause that thought right there, and we'll come right back to it after this very quick word from our sponsor, the Barnes Review.
If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or You could subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you could subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
Okay, the Alabama was sunk by the Kearsarge in June 1864, and it was pretty much at that point that Bulloch decided he wanted to have another ship to replace the Kearsarge, replace the Alabama, which had been sunk by the Kearsarge. Now, the thing is, by the end of 1864, almost all United States sailing ships were under the flags of other countries. So for example, towards the end of its career, the Alabama would stop a ship, and they could usually tell by the lines of the ship, whether it was British or French or United States. He could tell by the lines that it was a United States ship, but he went to check the papers, and Admiral Sims and the papers would say this ship is the Orinoco owned by the government of Brazil or Panama or Spain or Great Britain. So almost all the merchant ships, even coming out of the United States, were under foreign ownership so that they would not be destroyed by the Alabama. So when
was that a legitimate ownership by the foreign interests, or were those just forged papers?
No, they were legitimate. If they had been forged, the captains of the Alabama and later the Shenandoah could tell if the papers were forged or not. But if they had some feeling that maybe it's forged, but I better not take a chance, they wouldn't do anything against those ships. So, for example, that is why by the middle end of 1864, Bulloch decided, with the blessing of the Richmond government, that this new Confederate raider going out would be going against the whaling fleet. The whaling fleet they knew was from New Bedford in New England, and they knew these New Englanders were so proud that they would keep the ships under their control, and the ships were in the far north of the Pacific Ocean where the captains felt they were safe. So that was the mission of the Shenandoah. Now, the Shenandoah, it was originally constructed as a troop transport on loan to the British Navy called the Sea King. There is actually a book I'm looking at here. The title of the book is The Sea King, which is a biography of the Shenandoah and its captain, Captain James Waddell, and it's kind of a play on words, that the Sea King as the original name of the Shenandoah, and also Captain Waddell as the Sea King, as commander of the Shenandoah. So Bulloch, through a third party, this is getting into the weeds again. Bulloch, through a third party, was able to purchase the Sea King, and he knew that the U.S. representatives in Liverpool and in London were looking at everything he was doing. Especially they knew he was the man behind the Alabama. So now they were not going to let anything slip through. So what he did, he would have the Sea King go to various ports and unload cargo and pick up cargo. The thing is, most of the cargo that was unloaded and loaded were empty crates, because he was just doing this as a smokescreen, as a camouflage. And so eventually the Sea King left England. It had no visible guns aboard. It had nothing to show that it was going to be a raider. He had the ship go down to the Madeira Islands, which are off of the north coast of Africa. He had purchased another ship, which secretly, that he loaded up with guns and revolvers and cannon, and they met up off of Madeira. And I'll give you some of the, if there's people in the audience into the Navy, the specifications for the Shenandoah. It was 230 feet long, 32 and a half feet wide at the beam. It had a 20-foot draft. It was a fully rigged composite ship. I know none of these ships exist here in the United States. I believe there may be one in England, in a Southampton or someplace, in a naval museum. But a composite ship meant it had full sails, 3 masts, and it also had a auxiliary steam engine with a propeller. So if there was no wind, it could go under steam. But the thing is, under steam, the ship only went 8 knots, about 10 miles an hour. But under sail, it could go 16 knots, close to 20 miles an hour. So it was what was called a clipper ship, very fast, very smooth. And for its armament, it had 4 8-inch smoothbore cannons, 2 12-pounder rifled cannons, and 2 32-pounder cannons. So even as a raiding ship, it was pretty well armed. So it loaded in Madeira. Captain Waddell tried to get men aboard. It should have had a complement of between 100 and 120 men. When they left Madeira, it had a complement of about 50 men. It was over half undermanned. But some of those men, one man was Irvine Bullock, who was James Bullock's half-brother. And actually, President Teddy Roosevelt used to tell the story, when the Alabama was sunk by the Kearsarge, my uncle Irvine was the man who fired the last gun off of the Alabama. So see, Teddy Roosevelt, even though he was born and raised in New York City, he had no problem being proud of his uncle Irvine. And Teddy Roosevelt also, he wrote at least half a dozen books. His first 2 books were a history of the United States Navy in the War of 1812, and he dedicated it to my uncle, James Bullock, retired U.S. Navy. He did not mention that his uncle had been deeply involved. Actually, Irvine and James, these 2 brothers, they stayed after the war in Liverpool, and their graves are in Liverpool. And the listeners, you can do a web search, When Liverpool Was Dixie. There is a website dedicated to what the Confederacy did in Liverpool during our Civil War.
So that's interesting.
So the Shenandoah starts on its cruise. It stops a few ships, and as I mentioned before, the captain would go on the other ships, check their papers. If the ship he knew was a United States ship that had United States papers, he would transfer all the people onto the Shenandoah. Their goods, like canned goods, they had salted beef or whatever his crew could use, and then he would burn this other ship. So he sailed around South Africa, and there was a story given that they were going through the Indian Ocean, and Captain Waddell would get up at night, and he told his men, there's something wrong with the ship. Check everything. So they did a cursory. Sorry, sir, couldn't find anything. He went back, tried to get to sleep. He said, it's the propeller. There's something wrong with the machinery. Have a very thorough look. So they went in and they took the cover off of the rod connecting the propeller with the engine, and they discovered that the rod had been welded together. And that's what was wrong. I was making the noise that the captain, some people say, a captain is married to his ship. Waddell was married to the Shenandoah. He knew all the creaks and groans, and he could tell that there was something wrong with the engine, and it was the shaft. So what happened was they went through the Indian Ocean, and they wound up in Melbourne, which is the second part of this talk I give. When did the Civil War really end, and what did Australia have to do with it? Well, for 1 month, January to February 1865, the Shenandoah was laid up in Melbourne. Actually, if you do a web search for CSS Shenandoah in Australia, the only known photograph of the Shenandoah was taken in all places in Melbourne, Australia. And even there in Melbourne, there was a United States consul who tried to get the ship impounded and failed. And there's a somewhat ironic or funny story that the ship sailed out of Melbourne, and when they got back into international waters, that 50 or 60 men came out of various places in the ship. The captain, the first mate, wrote in their diaries, "We are shocked." It reminded me, if you know the movie Casablanca, the French chief of police, "Mr. Rick, you have gambling going on here? I am shocked. Give me my winnings."
Yeah.
So actually, the men, while the ship was being repaired, were enjoying daylight and nightlife in Melbourne, and some of them were trying to convince sailors to come on board the Shenandoah, which was technically illegal because at that point Australia was part of the British Empire. And so when they left Australia, and all of a sudden these 50 or 60 men come out, and we're shocked. We had no idea. Actually, we did, but they had to write something to cover their butts and their official logs. So they went up into what's now Micronesia, the southern Pacific Islands. They found a place where there were 4 whalers holed up there. They burned them in the harbor, and they sailed up past Japan, what was called the Sea of Atusk near Vladivostok, and they found 1 whaler there, and the whaler inadvertently he said, "Where are the rest of the whalers?" And he said, "Oh, they were over in the Bering Sea." Uh-oh. So they sailed back up into the Bering Sea, past the Aleutian Islands, and he found about 24 whaling ships there. There were no Union gunboats to protect them. He rounded them all up. He actually captured 12. Some of them escaped up into the Arctic Sea, so he captured 12 of them. He burned 9 of them and took all the men and supplies and put them on the 3 remaining ships. There were illustrations in like the New York Times, the New York World, Frank Leslie's illustrated of ships on fire and people, hanging on the rails, burning. Complete nonsense.
So calendar-wise, when did this take place? What month and year?
It was June 1865, almost July, right after Sam Watty had surrendered the last group of Confederate soldiers to the United States. If you want to give April as the the actual pretty much end of the Confederacy. Let's see, May, the jig had been up already 2 or 3 months.
And so what you're saying then is that long after even the last of the holdouts of the ground forces had stopped fighting, the Navy was still fighting and was still sinking Union ships.
Yeah. Actually, at one point, it had received newspapers that said General Lee had surrendered. But in the same newspapers, there was a letter from President Jefferson Davis saying if there are any ships, if there's anybody out there still fighting, fight on. Many of these ships, the whaling ships that were burned, the men said, the war's over, the war's over. And Captain Waddell and his officers said, we can't believe you lying Yankees. So if there's any tree huggers in the audience, you should appreciate that because of Captain Waddell and the depredations of the whaling fleet, whale oil was almost completely destroyed. The price went sky high. But just a few years before, there was something called kerosene that had just been cracked from this oily gunk that was coming up out of the ground in Pennsylvania called petroleum. So due to the depredations of the Shenandoah, whale oil was almost completely done away with, and now people lit their houses and things with kerosene, which is still used up to the present day. Now, after getting rid of the pretty much the New Bedford whaling fleet, Waddell, well, there's one interesting story. They were going through the Bering Sea. There were icebergs, even in June and July. And at one point, the Shenandoah rammed into an iceberg. But luckily, it had not been going fast. Captain Waddell threw the engine into reverse, and they backed off. And actually, the most famous ship that ran into an iceberg was the Titanic, and some people who've studied the Titanic now say that if the Titanic had ran straight on into that iceberg, it would have survived. It would have just damaged the bow of the ship. But because it tried to avoid the iceberg, and the iceberg scraped under the waterline and opened it up, and it sunk in about 2 hours. Waddell was able to save his ship. It had copper sheeting on it. It was pretty strong. So they're going down the West Coast, and he says, aha, before the war, I was on board a United States ship in San Francisco. I've got an idea. Let's attack San Francisco. Now, I think what is going on in at this point, what is San Francisco most famous for?
I'm going to assume the gold rush.
Yeah. And by that time, it had a mint. And Waddell had an idea. We're going to bombard San Francisco, hold it for ransom, whatever they got, $25, $50 million. We'll take it, steam back to Richmond, be conquering heroes. So they're going towards San Francisco. They happen to stop a British ship called the Barracuda. The Barracuda had more recent newspapers than they'd gotten before, and the papers said, well, it's already been almost 6 months that we have our Union back. Jefferson Davis is now being held in Fortress Monroe. And by the way, our glorious Union fleet is out on the high seas looking for this pirate ship, the Shenandoah. So Waddell thought, what am I going to do? Some of the men said, hey, let's go back to Melbourne. Nice climate there, pretty young ladies. And he said, no, we started off in England, we're going back. So all the guns, everything was stowed in the ship. And of course, when most of the time when the Shenandoah was under cruise, it was what they called false flags. In the Atlantic and Indian Ocean, the Shenandoah used the Union Jack, and in the Pacific Ocean, it flew under the Russian flag because Russia was the main. Because remember, at that point, Russia had Siberia, Russia had Alaska. So the Shenandoah goes around South America. November 6, 1865, winds up in Liverpool and hauls down the last Confederate flag, and that flag is currently in what used to be called the Museum of the Confederacy in Richmond. And usually on the anniversary, November 6th, they take the flag. It's a second national flag, the one that's all white except for the canton has the cross of St. Andrews, red, white, and blue. And the flag itself it's like 8 feet high and about 12 feet long. It's huge because it was the naval flag flown off of the stern, the rear of the ship. And the white part is kind of grayish now, but the canton looks like it was just made a couple years ago, and it's now 150 years old. So thus ended the war between the states, I believe, pretty much November 6, 1865. Now, Captain Liddell, he stayed in Great Britain until the 1870s. He came back to the United States, and by the early 1880s, he was the admiral of the Maryland Navy.
Okay.
The Maryland Navy was fighting the it was called the Oyster Wars. It's very interesting that the boundaries of Maryland on the water, for example, if you go across let's say the Woodrow Wilson Bridge, you probably think the boundary between Maryland and Virginia is somewhere in the middle of the river. Actually, the boundary of Maryland goes right up to the Virginia shore, which the Virginians have always had problems with for the past 300 years. So Virginia oystermen would come out into the Potomac and the Chesapeake, try to dredge the oysters, in the Maryland waters, and so there was practically this war, as they called it. And Liddell was the captain of the commander of the Maryland fleet, and he is buried in St. Anne's Church Cemetery in Annapolis. And until recently, the Maryland division of the Sons of Confederate Veterans would have a commemoration. Actually, the last one might have been a year ago. I was the speaker there. Now, the Shenandoah, what happened to it was the United States, when the Shenandoah arrived in Liverpool, the British Navy took it over. And they said, okay, if there's anybody on board your ship who is a British citizen, voyage has been illegal. So the men were from all over the world. So you had these people with Cockney accents from Scotland, from France, from Australia. And young man, where are you from? Why, I'm from Mobile, Alabama. I'm from Pensacola, Florida. I'm from Richmond, Virginia. I'm from Charlotte, North Carolina. They were all schooled to say that they were from someplace in the now defunct Confederacy. So by the time the American Council, which is another side, the American Council was Charles Francis Adams, and he's considered one of the best diplomats the United States ever had, especially during the war. You might have heard Adams. Just so happened his father was John Quincy Adams, his grandfather was President John, so two of his immediate ancestors were presidents of the United States, and he'd been picked by President Lincoln, and it was almost like a undeclared war between Charles Francis Adams and James Bullock. Francis was, of course, in London. Bullock was in Liverpool, and it was like an undeclared war, who could outsmart the other one. So by the time Charles Francis Adams sent somebody to the ship, everybody was gone. But the ship was confiscated. They tried to get it back to the United States in the middle of winter. It came back after about a week. All the sails were shredded. Couldn't make it through the North Atlantic in the winter time. The ship itself was eventually sold the next year to the Sultan of Zanzibar. That is off the coast of East Africa. He wanted to fit it up as a pleasure ship, but his treasurer said, no, it'll too much money. Just use it as a cargo ship. So he used it as a cargo ship. It got caught in a storm, and the Shenandoah is somewhere on the bottom of the Indian Ocean. But if you want to see one thing remaining from the Shenandoah, have you ever been to the United States Naval Academy?
Yes, sir. In Annapolis?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Have you been to their museum there? Their naval museum.
It's been a number of years.
Okay, if you go to the naval, they have, the Revolutionary War section, War of 1812, Civil War, Spanish American, World War I, World War II. If you go to the Civil War section, there is a small cannon, which looks very British. The legs holding it up are in the shape of lions, and it's right there in the museum. And that's the last, or the only thing that I know of remaining from the CSS Shenandoah. And it's interesting that in the early 1960s, the U.S. Navy commissioned a guided missile destroyer, the USS Waddell. Now, the most interesting thing is the USS Waddell, it was part of the Charles Francis Adams class of ships. So this Confederate and Union man were finally united in this guided missile destroyer, which was a Waddell, but it was under the Charles Francis Adams class of warships.
On that note, Doctor, let's cut to a brief word from our sponsor, the American Free Press.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today. I know this. I know that I've got a tremendous education just listening to you for the last hour. I think one of the mistakes that we've made is that we've spent so much time studying the intricate details of the land battles, and there's a lot of treasure in the naval battles that we're not even mining for, apparently.
Right. I mean, some people know vaguely about the Alabama, and actually the Alabama went around South Africa and got as far as Singapore, but it did not circumnavigate. The Shenandoah, its final record was it was the only Confederate ship to circumnavigate the globe. It left England in October 1864 remained at sea for almost 13 months, returned in November 1865. It captured 38 ships, sunk 32 of them. Nobody died in the warfare. 2 men on board the Shenandoah died, and they both, I think one died of appendicitis or some kind of natural causes. Another member of the crew had been, I believe, seriously wounded at the Battle of Shiloh and had left the Confederate Army, joined up with the Confederate Navy, and he died from his wounds, and that was it. And also, every ship that they attacked, nobody was, as a matter of fact, when they captured those 12 whaling ships, at one point they had about 1,000 prisoners. So that's why they had to save those 3 whaling ships, to put all the prisoners on board and made sure that they had enough goods with them that they could reach San Francisco on their own.
Well, we only have a couple minutes left, but I'm curious,
Yeah.
since the war had basically ended and they were still fighting it, who would they have turned these prisoners over to?
Well, they couldn't. That's why Waddell saved those ships, so that he put the prisoners on. And actually, there were, I remember in the South Atlantic, he stopped one ship that was under United States registry, and he burned the ship, took about 50 or 60 people off of it, and then when they got to a small island that he knew ships passed by every 2 or 3 months, he said, "I will leave you here with supplies, Godspeed."
Okay.
He wouldn't just throw them overboard or dump them on some, unknown island. He would leave people where they were in the shipping lane, so he knew every couple months a ship would come through, and they would within a reasonable time, because his goal was to destroy United States shipping, not to kill people.
Right.
So I guess you can say it was pretty much the end of chivalry in the Navy, because I believe from World War I, with the U-boats and everything, ships were sunk, and good luck. Nobody was or very seldom were, especially the Germans, would not pick anybody up. Just sink the ships and sail off in their Untersee boats. But like I mentioned at the beginning, if people can contact me mainly through email, william.connery@verizon.net. And if people are interested, like I have a PowerPoint presentation on this talk on the Shenandoah, also on my 2 history press books, Civil War Northern Virginia 1861 and Mosby's Raids in Civil War Northern Virginia. I have another talk under the title Honoring President Robert E. Lee. In other words, what General Lee did after the war as president of Washington College. Again, I think most people, Lee surrendered and then he just disappeared. No, he lived another 5 years, and he did a lot of work binding up the wounds of the nation. I have another talk on what happened at Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor during the Civil War. And President John Tyler in the Peace Conference. John Tyler was the only president ever declared a traitor.
Okay.
Because he was elected to the Confederate States Congress. He was the only ex-president at that time that supported the Confederacy. And he died in 1862, and there was no monument placed on his grave in Richmond until 1916. People can hold grudges, as we see, for a long, long time.
I know I've enjoyed our conversation, and I look forward to seeing this broadcast here in the next few weeks.
Okay. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, sir. God bless.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
That's about all the time that we have this week for TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour. I hope that you enjoyed listening to the interview with historian William Connery. I know I certainly learned a lot. I'm sure you did too. Please go to our website, www.dixieheritage.net. Click to receive a free copy of our weekly newsletter, a free copy of my ebook, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. You will not be charged for either. We want to give them to you freely. And as always, we thank you for taking the time each week to tune into TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour. I look forward to being with you again next week. Until then, God bless.